Yep, that's us all good to go. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got quite a few people with us in the room here in Click Meeting, which is lovely. Lovely to see you all. Professor Jones is with us today. Hi, Professor. How are you doing?
Good afternoon. I'm very well, thank you.
Good, good. It's always lovely to have you. I just want to do a little disclaimer before we start as well, just to remind you that the Q&As do not take the place of a consultation with your own clinician. In these sessions, we're aiming to provide general medical information and not medical advice. Just be careful too, if you're on Facebook, it's a public forum, and if you want a wee bit more privacy, you can join us in the room here in Click Meeting as well. So we're going to make a start to the questions that have been sent in for us, and I'll keep an eye live in the two sessions as well to see if there's anything that comes in.
Before we do that, can I just do a couple of news items?
Absolutely.
In my best Trevor MacDonald way. So what we've done is to use these opportunities these sessions just to kind of update people on some important stuff that's happening. So two things. The first is people may have noticed or may not have done that seladelpar has now been licensed in America. So this is the third of the licensed second-line therapies after obeticholic acid and elafibranor. And that's excellent news. It's only in America simply because of the time scale, so it's not been approved in other places. It's just the order in which it's being done. So I think we all confidently expect that all three drugs will be licensed by the end of the year and beginning to be available. And certainly in our own centre, anybody who's come to see us knows that we're already talking about them and the options for people. And as a clinician, I would always say it is best to have different options because tolerability of drugs is something that is a strange thing. Different people can tolerate different drugs, and so having alternative options is very important. And then the other thing is anybody who, like me, has high blood pressure, you'll realise that we've moved away from giving people larger and larger doses of a single drug to start to use combinations which are more effective. So that's very important. And all three of the companies, as everyone will know, are very supportive of PBC Foundation, are very supportive of research in PBC, and we have helped nationally and internationally with their development program. So that's excellent news.
It is. It's just
the ever-unfolding story. Yeah. So the other is the ever-unfolding story about obeticholic acid and its license. And I won't go over the stuff that we talked about before, but something has happened today that most of you may have heard about, or a number of you have heard about, but won't have made the connection. And this issue is, just as a quick recap, is that there was quite a bureaucratic decision made to withdraw obeticholic acid. It wasn't about safety. It was about what evidence they will regard as acceptable that it works. And in a sense, not accepting what people might see with their own eyes, if you like, as an acceptable form of evidence. And that's a decision of the EMA that was quite a bureaucratic one. And I think many people, myself included, didn't agree with it. The FDA are going to make their own decision. There's a process going to kick off in September about that. But for those of you here in the United Kingdom, there are other countries available, I believe. But this is about people in the United Kingdom. We have our own regulator called the MHRA, Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Authority, who were pioneers in all of this and were subsumed into the AMA and are now doing it independently in the UK. And they're responsible for deciding. Now, two things have happened. One is they decided that they did not agree up front with the EMA decision, so are going to make their own decision. And that's a really important step because that's what we wanted, and all credit to the foundation for the noise which we all made about this. And sometimes you have to say, you have to create a noise to be seen. And I think it's been a really effective example of making a noise, lobbying, arguing, saying, hang on a second, this is process gone mad. Can't we take a step back and look at it? So about a week or so, the MHRA announced that they will make their own decision, which is a very important thing. And MHRA have the ability to make their own decision. They do not have to. They can follow the EMA decision if they want to, but they don't have to. Okay. So what has happened today that is relevant? Well, you may have heard about the approval of an Alzheimer's drug that's been in the news and the newspapers today. And the reason why it's important is that drug was turned down by the EMA. And the news today is about MHRA approving it for use in the UK because they do not believe that the EMA made the right decision. And that is the first time that they have diverged from the EMA. And the reason that matters to all of us is that they have decided they're not just going to slavishly follow, they're going to look at their own information. And they felt that the EMA hadn't done two things. One is they hadn't looked at all the evidence, which is what we think has happened for obeticholic acid, and they didn't take enough account of the views of patients and families. And I think we would all say hallelujah to that. And the fact that that's now happened, so obeticholic acid wouldn't be the first time. Let's hope they developed a taste for it. So those are two hot off the press news items. So that Alzheimer's thing, you'll see it all over the internet and the news.
I saw it in the news this morning, yeah.
With Alzheimer's, but it's also an important step for rational decision about drugs, which is very important.
Making
and
their own
with that goes the weather after my news update.
And hopefully setting a precedence as well, which is...
Well, actually, if I was... Yes, exactly. I think that's very important. You've got to make decisions. Of course you have. Fundamentally, safety is the #1 priority, but neither of obeticholic acid nor the Alzheimer's drug was about safety. They were both completely safe drugs. The question was how much they benefited people and to what extent certain tests show that benefit. Okay. I've been busy, and sometimes if you want to do sometimes a trial effect is very obvious and you can see it in your own eyes. But as I always say to people, I've never been to India, but I believe the evidence suggests that it exists as a country. And so sometimes you have to have that indirect effect, if you like. So you need to be able to look at all of that. So it's about sensible decision making. Can I take question answer as prerogative and answer a question that has popped up from Sally Perrin? And I'm guessing this is to show that I'm not a hologram. I'm a live person reading things and answering questions. I can multitask. There you go. So Sally asked, this new drug approved in America, can you advise what that does that Urso doesn't? That's a really good question.
Good question,
so the drug is seladelpar. Now, it's like all of these drugs. Gosh, it hasn't just emerged and is a surprise to all of us. We've been collectively involved in the trials of this drug for about 8 or 9 years. So, these things are part of a process that we knew this was coming, but it's still very important. So the answer to the question is that ursodeoxycholic acid is largely passive as a drug. So the heart of PBC is that you get bile acids build up in the liver, and PBC patients have a sort of profile of bile acids which is not a healthy one. So bile acids you have to produce because they help you absorb your fat from your diet. So fat won't dissolve in water, so the bile acids are released. They act as a detergent, allows fat to be absorbed. So they're an important part. They're an important part of daily nutrition. So and some bile acids are quite neutral, don't cause any harm, and some bile acids are quite irritant to the body. And I often say to people, if you've had bilious vomiting, you've had green vomiting, often you feel really sickly with that. That's the irritant effect of bile acids. So in PBC patients, the bile acids get retained in the liver a bit because of the bile ducts, and they you have a profile which is a bit irritant. And from that comes liver irritation, etc., etc., etc. So what urso does largely is that it gets absorbed in and it dilutes the irritating bile acid. So if you give a very large dose of non-irritating bile acid, then you dilute the effect of the more irritating one. So that's how it works. It basically replaces, the ones that are causing the problem. Okay. Now, for many people with PBC, probably about 2/3, something like that, that's all you need. That effect is enough on its own, and that's all you need. And that's why we give ursodeoxycholic acid as the first treatment to everybody. But in the other third of people, it's not enough. And people's blood tests don't improve enough. And that's typically perhaps slightly younger patients have a disease that's a little bit more aggressive. And urso is good, but it's not enough. It's like, my analogy is that, it's like putting a fire out with a bucket of water. It's fine if it's a waste paper bin fire, but not if it's a house fire. So for some people with a more aggressive disease, that just sort of diluting effect isn't enough. And what all of the second line drugs that we use do is they switch off bile acid production. Okay. So rather than just hoping that you dilute out the effect of the toxic ones, you just turn the tap off, basically. And that's what they do. And of course, the reason why we get people to take urso, even though they haven't responded to it, is of course that gives you your natural bile acid to allow you to absorb your fat. So what all of these drugs do is do an active effect, which is over and above the passive effect of urso. So basically they turbocharge the effect, and they have other actions and they work in different ways, and that's important, but largely they are active to suppress those bile acids, and that's how they work. Now at the end of the day, whether you need them or not depends on lots of things, but largely, basically, have you had enough of an effect with urso? And that's something to discuss with your doctors. If your blood tests are normal on urso, then that's fine, that's all you need. But for people who aren't in that position, these are 3 different options that work in slightly different ways that will be beneficial to have, and that is an important step forward. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. And thank you for sharing the news with us earlier as well. That's amazing news. And it's great that we can take the opportunity on our Q&As to share that as well. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Right, so I'm going to go to the first of our questions that we've had sent in. So our first one is around right rib pain that comes and goes. Is it related to PBC? And if so, how to alleviate the pain?
Yeah, okay, right. So right-sided rib pain.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the things that we all need to be aware of is those things that are linked to PBC and those things that aren't linked to PBC. And I collect a, slightly, tongue-in-cheek collection of all the things that GPs have said, talk to the PBC specialist about it. The worst was somebody had broken their arm. I'm not sure what I was supposed to bring to the table on that one. And it's a fact of life. And sometimes where somebody's got a complicated condition, and PBC is quite complicated, it's rare, most doctors don't really understand it. I'm not telling you any secrets when I say most doctors don't understand it. And so there can be a tendency to assume that things are part of PBC, partly because you don't know otherwise, and partly because it kind of is a sort of a way of passing the issue on to somebody else. Okay. Now, some things are linked to PBC and some things aren't linked to PBC. That doesn't make them more or less important. It just means whether something in the PBC sphere, helps us understand it and to treat it better. Okay. When people have conditions that are, or problems that aren't linked to PBC, the PBC is still an issue, of course, because it may impact on the treatments you get. So that's very important. So this is a question we get all of the time. I've got X, Y, and Z. Are those linked to my PBC or not? And really, a lot of this is based on our experience of what people say and do. So pain on the right side of the chest, rib cage, underneath the rib cage. Now that is an area where you do get pain with PBC, and the reason for that is that the liver doesn't actually have any nerves as part of it. So it has no nerves in the liver, but the liver is surrounded by kind of what we call a capsule, which is a fibrous covering that basically keeps the liver, in the right place. The liver is very soft and gooey. I hope everyone's had their lunch, but the liver is very soft and gooey. And if you didn't have the capsule, it would blob all over the place. And so the capsule keeps it all in the right place. And the capsule does have nerve fibers in it. And so if the liver swells for any reason, then that capsule gets stretched, and that's what causes pain. Okay. So when people get pain with PBC, it's almost always because the capsule is stretched because of the bile acids building up and the irritation. And the liver, although you think of it as being in your tummy in the abdomen, it's actually tucked under the ribs. So it's underneath your rib cage on the right hand side. It's there because a soft and gooey thing, isn't a good thing if you, crash your car or something like that. So the rib, it's under the rib cage to protect it. We've evolved that way. And so pain underneath the rib cage is almost always because the liver is stretched a little bit. In that situation, actually, usually in our experience, the right treatment for PBC kind of makes a difference. So if you're not on urso tends to do it. One of the second line therapies tends to do it. So in our experience, this goes away as a problem when you treat the PBC. Okay. The caveats to that, one is that the one that everyone thinks about is gallstone pain. And gallstones used to be quite common in PBC. They're not so common now because urso helps dissolve them. And of course, everybody's on urso. Urso is in fact invented as a treatment to dissolve gallstones. So I think that the use of urso over all these decades has had that major effect. We just don't see gallstones with any of the frequency we used to. So most people who have kind of been told recently, oh, this pain is gallstones, it usually isn't. And don't let anybody take your gallbladder out on the basis of this pain. It doesn't make it go away. But you will still see people with gallstones occasionally, and gallstones can cause discomfort, which may or may not need an operation, but they can also cause mischief occasionally by blocking the pancreas and creating problems. So it is something we think about and look at, but for most people urso has dealt with it. And then of course there are the potential causes of actual rib pain, which are nothing to do with PBC. So, it is important to be aware of that. And so fractures of the ribs, usually it's the character of the pain. When I was a baby medical student in about the 14th century, it feels like that long time ago, but we didn't have all the scanners and things we have now. So I bore people about, in the olden days, I've turned into that type of doctor. But in the old days, you didn't have all these scanners and things. So we used to listen to words much more. And so we used to use the things that people said to us to understand what was going on. And I would argue we've lost that skill. So we used to talk about what's called the character of the pain. So pain is not pain. Pain is different for different types. Just think about, an indigestion pain and toothache, and, there are, constipation pain. They're very different. And that will help give it away. By the way, the other one where that character is incredibly important to working out what's going on is itch in PBC, because people keep coming along now these days and saying, we've got this test, we've got this blood test for PBC itch. And to which I say, why would I want that? Why not just ask people, are you itching? And they say, but it could be lots of things. It is the easiest thing in the world because of the deep under the skin, the creepy crawlies, the odd distribution. It's the easiest. Everyone and anyone who says it's difficult just hasn't talked to enough people with itch. It's very characteristic. So those are the things that go through my mind. It's very common. We tend to use urso plus other second line therapies. And actually, once you get these under control, it tends not to be an issue. If it does continue as a problem, worth getting an ultrasound scan, which we tend to do every so often in people anyway, just to make sure that there aren't some gallstones as the alternative part of it. And just other thing is that the other place where you get gallstone pain, you get it underneath the ribs on the right hand side, but you also get it in the tip of your shoulder blade. Just underneath your shoulder blade. And the reason for that is that the way nerves are distributed in the body is often a little bit odd, and the nerves that supply just under your shoulder blade are the ones that supply the gallbladder. So if you get shoulder tip pain, it's what we call a referred pain. It's why a heart attack pain affects your left arm. Your heart isn't in your left arm, but the body has been fooled. Okay.
We actually have a question that's come in live that's connected to that I'm going to take now. It says, would your pancreas numbers going up have anything to do with PBC? I have pain in that region going into back.
Okay, yeah. So that's important. So we do see, pancreas, we'll recap a little bit. So the pancreas gland sits at the back of your abdomen, and it releases what we call pancreatic juice, which is part of what the body needs to be able to absorb food. So if you have a nice plate of fish and chips and things, that needs to be broken down into its constituent parts so the body can use it. Okay. And we've evolved to have this quite complicated system, part of which is the bile acids, which solubilize fat. But also, once you've solubilized it, you need to break it down into its components as you need to break down proteins and carbohydrates. And the things that break down food into its components are all enzymes produced by the pancreas. So you eat your fish and chips, your body produces a jet of bile acids that go out and dissolve the fat. At the same time, your pancreas produces a jet of fluid which contains all of the enzymes that help break the food down. So that's what your pancreas does. So what on earth has the pancreas got to do with PBC? Well, we do see pancreatic problems with PBC, and it's one of there are certain things in PBC which kind of aren't recognised or have been rather forgotten about, actually, and actually are definitely there. So pancreas is one of those issues, and we see two problems. One is people can actually have a loss of pancreatic function. So the pancreas can be underproductive. It's almost as if it's a part of the autoimmune process, okay? And certainly back in the day, when I started in all of this, you're going to keep hearing this. I did my first PBC clinic in 1991, and boy, do I tell everybody. We used to see a lot of people with real weight issues who are significantly underweight. So we used to see usually tiny ladies, 4 or 5 stone, who really struggled to put any weight on, and they all had this abnormality in the pancreas because as part of the disease it had become a bit dysfunctional, and we tend again to see that much less than we used to. And I do wonder again whether URSO might have had an effect with all of that, but it's still there, and we still do treat people with pancreatic enzymes occasionally with it all. So it's one of the reasons why dietitians are very helpful in PBC. So poor pancreatic function is a feature of PBC, and it's under-recognised. The other reason is the one I said, that if you get a gallstone or you get sludgy bile that interferes with bile flow, then that can gloop up the pancreatic duct, which joins the bile duct. And obviously the stuff that digests your dinner, if it sits around in the pancreas, will digest your pancreas. And that's how you see pancreatitis. So gallstone pancreatitis is something that we do see. Mm-hmm. How might you have, I mean, it's not common, don't get me wrong, this is not common in PBC, but you know, we've seen it. So what might make somebody think that they have a pancreatic problem? Well, 2 things. One is there's quite characteristic pain. Well, 3 things. One is a characteristic pain which goes through from your tummy, the front to the back, okay? So it's in the back, and it's in the front, but it's not in the sides, whereas a gallstone pain goes round the side. Traditionally, that's what we always talk about. The second one is because you're not producing, we're not producing the pancreatic juice that helps you absorb food. The food stays in your gut, so you tend to lose weight, but you also tend to have very loose stools because the fat stays in your bowel and creates fat diarrhea. And then the third one is that you can have blood tests, particular blood tests that go with a particular one called one that's called amylase, but also lipase. These are the enzymes you can measure in the blood. So I think somebody who's got, you know, pancreatic numbers going up and has got pain going through to their back, I think it's very important to get that looked at. And the first instance, it's imaging that you would do. So the first instance with that would be a CT scan to look at the pancreas. Mm-hmm. And then after that, probably what we call an MRCP, which is a magnetic resonance scan to look at the bile duct to see whether there is an issue with bile flow. Mm-hmm. And then there is a whole specialty of people who look after this now, and they have various different clever endoscope tests where they can look at all of this. So in the average year, I wouldn't see anybody with pancreatic problems, but I've seen quite a lot over the many years I've done it. So there is a link, yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple of questions actually that I've got on the list, but also one that's come in live as well around COVID. So I'm going to ask, is there any connection to PBC and COVID or the COVID jabs? And is it advised to continue receiving COVID and flu jabs?
COVID. I'll kind of just my experience. The data is kind of not great on it all, so I'll give you our experience. So as people will know, I think we look after about 1,000 people with PBC, and that's a reasonable number. So it gives us a real sense, you know, if we are seeing a lot of something and we're not seeing a lot of something, it's kind of relevant. So like everybody else, when COVID came along, we were very worried because of all of the issues around shielding and the need for people to avoid this, because we were into the unknown a little bit. Okay. And one of the groups that there was concern was people with chronic liver disease, which is obviously PBC, and it was one of those. And then the other was people with immune conditions. Okay. So people were advised as a precautionary principle to be very cautious indeed. And then after that, basically absolutely nothing happened. And so we did not see any significant issues with COVID in our population. So we saw people getting COVID, but we did not see people being hospitalized with COVID and all its complications. Okay, so it turned out to be much less concerning than people perhaps were worried about. Okay, which was a pleasant surprise, and which is interesting. Okay, and we're now very interested about that. I'll tell you maybe some of the reason why it is. The advice I gave at the time with vaccinations when they first came in is something that I will keep saying, which is that there are two major advances that dramatically improved human survival. One was the availability of clean water, and then the other was the availability of vaccination. It's not antibiotics or statins. Those have had a difference, but not at the same scale. So we forget the benefits of vaccines because they're part of everyday life, and we worry about the risks and things. But I'll just tell you, I work where we have our clinic in Newcastle is on the old Newcastle General Hospital. It's an old hospital site that's being redeveloped. When I started as a junior doctor in the late 80s, we still had people treated in an iron lung for polio on the ward. Okay, so people who essentially spent their life in an iron lung breathing for them because they got polio. And people nowadays would hear that and think that's something out of the 20s or 30s, but it was there in my working lifetime. Why do we not see that anymore? Vaccination. Okay, so I think we sometimes, where things have a dramatic benefit, we sometimes forget of that benefit. We see this in PBC with people who have been on rifampicin for years and never had any itch, and they think, oh, I don't need it anymore, and then they stop taking it, and then they realize they need it. We sometimes forget that just because that's something working a very long period of time does not mean you don't need it anymore. It just indicates it's been working over a very long period of time. So vaccination, in general terms, across the piece, has been an important part of improved human life and survival. Okay, COVID, I will tell you, I ran a COVID ward during the first wave of COVID. You see things you never want to see again. You saw stuff that you never want to see or hear of again. And it was really scary. But after the first wave, it wasn't really. That was through two things. One was, I think there was an actual change in the virus. So the viruses tend to become less pathogenic over time, because basically, if all a virus wants to do is make baby viruses. That's all viruses are there to do, make more baby viruses. And if you infect somebody and they die, that's not a great way to make and pass on baby viruses. In fact, what you want to do is to have people feel a bit unwell, sneezing all over the place, but still going to work, because then you get your baby viruses find somewhere to live. So there's an evolutionary advantage to actually not killing people for viruses. So I think there was a natural change with it all, but there is no doubt in my mind that vaccination changed the dynamic of this. And I think it's really important to understand what it does and what it doesn't do. Mm-hmm. What it doesn't do is stop you getting COVID, right? It is very, very clear that it made no difference whatsoever about infection. And vaccine passports, deciding whether you could go to the cinema or not, were a nonsense for that reason. You could not, it'd be like, putting your hands up and trying to stop water flowing. It had no impact on infectivity, but it had a major impact on what the virus did to you. So what it did was it didn't stop you getting it, but it stopped you dying of it. And that was very clear in terms of what we've seen. Largely, to an approximation, there are still people who get, who are very susceptible. So therefore, when COVID vaccines came in, it transformed that death risk, and young people dying horribly of COVID is something I don't want to ever see again. Okay. And, I think sometimes people, when are very negative about vaccines, I wish I could have filmed some of the things that I've seen. You've seen it in a different light. I'm not by the way, an evangelist for vaccines. I'm a keen student of the history of medicine. Now we are in a different world, I think, actually. Now we are in a different world where COVID is endemic. We can't stop it, it's everywhere, and we will all be getting COVID forever, every so often. And I had it 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was pretty miserable, and then I just got over it. There's been no particular occurrence of the bad versions of it. So people who are vaccinated seem to have long-lasting protection, not against the virus, but against the virus doing bad things to you. Okay. So if you were to say, did I have the vaccines, did I have the Pfizer vaccine as soon as I could do, working on a COVID ward? You bet I did. Okay. I'm a fat, I was going to say middle-aged, but I'm older than that. I'm a fat middle-aged man. You know, it's got me in its cross sites. So did I have the vaccines as soon as possible? Absolutely. Did I have the booster as soon as possible? Absolutely. Did I have the third one? Yes. Have I had a vaccine since? No, actually I haven't. Because we do see people with heart problems, we do see people with immune problems. It's all about balance. Okay. I'm not sure, you know, and I wasn't convinced about vaccinating children. I'm still not convinced about that, because vaccinating children, so, you know, the argument was that it will stop granny getting it, but it won't stop granny getting it. It will stop the child from having the complications that no child ever got with COVID. So I think at the time it was very important. I think it's less important now. That might change in the future, but most doctors I know haven't kept up with their boosters. I mean, I'll be honest. Flu is a different matter. Flu kills people, right? More people, since the beginning of COVID, more people have died of flu than died of COVID. But we build that into our normal thinking, people dying of flu. And I think that's more age related, you know, chronic unwellness related. And I think I would have a flu vaccine, but I wouldn't particularly have a COVID one unless it changes. Now, $64 million question. Why did COVID not cause problems in people with PBC when it absolutely should have done? Okay. And the answer appears to be ursodeoxycholic acid. And there is some really interesting work that came out that said ursodeoxycholic acid seems to stop the virus infecting cells or reduces the amount of the infectivity. Okay, completely unexpected. And actually, many people in this on the call in the UK will have been, you know, because of UK PBC and the genetic study, will have participated in this. So they phoned us up and said, we've got this really weird thing that COVID seems to, we looked at things that stop the COVID infecting cells, and we've come across this thing called deoxyurso acid. We've never heard of it, but we understand you know something about it. Well, yeah, we're a little bit familiar with it. And we suggested that they look to people with PBC because they're people, that's one of nature's experiments. They're people who've got it. And that's why people are have fewer problems, because urso appears to be protective. Weird, isn't it? To the extent that it's actually being developed as a therapy to use in people who can't be vaccinated. So there is a group of people, you know, for example, with blood cancers, who just didn't mount the response to the vaccine, so they are really at risk. And so just imagine urso. Everyone here knows urso is pretty straightforward to take, very safe, and actually as a preventative treatment, it's a really great thing. Now, there are some people with, you know, caveat, there are some people with PBC who are at risk of COVID, and you need to be very careful. So people after transplantation, because of the effects of immunosuppressant drugs, unpredictable. We don't think it's particularly tacrolimus or steroids, but we do have some concerns about MMF as a treatment, increasing susceptibility. Okay, you know, we didn't have any problems in our patients, but that is a different kettle of fish. And I would just be a little bit cautious about anybody with quite advanced cirrhosis. Although we have very few of those people, I think that's a slightly different situation. And of course, if people are taking steroids or, you know, MMF for management of overlap, then that does increase the risk. Although my response to that, and we could have a whole session on overlap, is that most people who think they've got overlap don't. And we tend to, when people come along taking those drugs for overlap, we tend to be stopping the drugs and starting one of the second line PBC therapies. So there you go. That's COVID. I think it's a really interesting one, but we thought it was going to be a problem in PBC, and it basically wasn't. Vaccination was really important. I think it's less so now, but who knows what the future holds. There you go.
And one of the questions we have, just to follow up on that, is do you think there's been an increase in incidence of PBC since COVID?
We're seeing a lot of it. We're seeing a lot of it. Everyone is reporting the same thing. We're all very busy. So we're seeing a lot of people with PBC in Newcastle, and we're also seeing a lot of people with urso non-responsive PBC. Now, you've got to be kind of careful to, association is not causation. Okay, so we think that the numbers of people that we're seeing with urso non-responsive people, essentially to go into taking a obeticholic acid or seladelpar or elafibranor, the people needing second-line treatment. We think the reason we're seeing a lot of people in our service is that there was a national audit done that people in the foundation are very familiar with. So an audit of care for PBC, which indicated that we're not nearly as good at doing this as we would like to think we are. And, obviously, perhaps the predictable centres were doing very well with it, but you didn't have to go very far to find centres that weren't doing very well. What we think has happened is that all the centres got their own results. They got a little bar graph which showed where they were compared to all the other centres. And we think a few of those had a wake-up call with it. They looked at this and they thought, oh my God, we're doing really badly. And then sent on all their higher risk patients to us, which of course is actually a desirable outcome. Mm-hmm. So I think the higher risk is because the audit did what we wanted it to do, which is to give people a wake-up call, basically. More PBC, it's difficult because it may be more diagnostic activity. So because people are thinking of immunological things, they're more likely to, so they're doing a lot more autoantibody screens, for example, in general. And most people with PBC, when they first have it, don't really have any features that would make you think they've got PBC. So if you do more random tests in people, then you will tend to find it more. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, does a tree in a forest that falls over with nobody there still make a noise? The answer is it does. Does PBC that you haven't got any symptoms from still need treating? Well, of course it does. That's the ideal time to treat it. So I think we celebrate the increased awareness of it. Certainly the other thing here is that certainly the Northeast, most people that come to us come with a letter from the GP saying, I saw this lady, did her bloods for some other reason or whatever, but anyway, she has AMA plus a raised alkaline phosphatase. I think she has PBC. Could you advise on her management, right? And that's a perfect referral because they've thought about it, they've seen the test, they've diagnosed it, and they've thought, oh, hang on a second, this isn't for me. Correctly, I don't think GPs should be managing PBC. And so they've sent us on. So right early on, and I always make a point in that situation of telling the patient that how well the GP's done, that they've done this really well, that they've spotted it, maybe that's all we need. And I put that in the letter to say, thank you, this is really helpful to us to have these early diagnoses. So I think that's partly, education and awareness. We bore people to tears about PBC in the Northeast, but mostly we see very good GP diagnoses and referrals, and that's what you're looking for. 10 years ago, it wasn't like that. So I think there is more diagnostic activity going on, therefore you'll see it more. So I personally think it's more awareness of it rather than an increase, but there may be an increase going on.
That's great, thank you. So our next question is, I was intrigued to learn from a recent Q&A that dizziness is a thing with PBC.
Yes.
That led me to look into falls with PBC and found that's a thing too. I haven't found any articles more recent than 2016. However, one published by Newcastle Uni, co-authored by our very own Professor Jones, talks of a multidisciplinary approach to addressing postural dizziness, poor balance and limb weakness. So just asking for a bit of advice on how would the patient initiate the multidisciplinary approach for their upcoming treatment?
Other universities are available, other clinics are available. It's important to say that. Yes, well, thank you. Well done. The reason why you won't find anything after 2016 is I don't think anybody's ever done anything really after 2016. So I think this is one of those areas where there was a lot of work and for a variety of reasons, there hasn't been more recently. So you're not missing anything much more recent than that. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you the story of it, actually, because it slightly tells you how research works. So if you've seen our papers, you will see that there's also another name called Julia Newton on those papers. So you'll see that, very old friend and colleague of mine. And why on earth did we end up looking at dizziness and blood pressure regulation? Well, the answer is Julia is a care of the elderly consultant, and she did falls work. So there's a big thing around preventing falls in the population for the simple reason that if people have falls for whatever reason, they break their hip, that's a really adverse thing. So, deal with the issue of hip and back fractures, not by employing more orthopedic surgeons to fix them, but to try and find the root causes and stop people doing it. So the NHS provides pretty comprehensive what's called falls and syncope services, or sometimes it's called the autonomic nervous system, autonomic clinics. There are a variety of different names for them, but most hospitals have one. And people who've had more than, anybody can have one fall. But if you've had falls, which aren't caused by tripping over the dog or something like that, if you've had a fall you can't quite explain, or you get profound dizziness that gosh, I could have keeled over, then they will see people to look at what's happening, and then most of all to treat it, which is to treat whatever the cause is. Okay, so falls and syncope services. And Julie's an old friend of mine, and she phoned me up to say, will you please stop sending all these patients? All I ever seem to do is see your patients. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, no, loads of your patients. They've all got fall problems. I mean, I'm joking. She joked at it, but we see so many of your patients. And I said, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that, because what we were doing is referring people to have a fall and not thinking twice about it. We weren't making the connection. And so that's where it all came from. And in fact, this tendency to have low blood pressure and to fall is actually very common in PBC. That came from all of that. Of course, what the falls and syncope service have are really clever tests to be able to look at it. So that they have two things. One is computerized heart testing, where they can look at the gaps between heartbeats and look at all of that. So the technology that's not available in ordinary clinics. And the other one is a tilt test, where they tilt you up and try and recreate those things. So they have technology that is very specialized, and they offer a very good service. So anybody who's had falls, should be referred to those, because largely prevent the risks of fracture. What became really interesting is when you looked at this, there was an absolutely storming association between low blood pressure and fatigue. Okay, so when you looked at that, it was very clear that something like 80% of people with bad fatigue had abnormalities of blood pressure regulation, compared to about 8% of people without fatigue. So these things seem to go together, which was novel and very interesting, although subsequently that has been shown to be a connection in chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID. So again, these things are associated. So there is an interesting association between poor blood pressure regulation and fatigue. And we think it's to do with perfusing the muscles and washing the acid, getting oxygen into your muscles, then washing the acid out of your muscles. And because the blood flow in and out isn't quite right, then that's what causes the fatigue. And the blood pressure issue is because people lose the normal regulation that they have to prevent them from keeling over when they stand up. So when you first stand up, your blood pressure the blood pools in your legs. And if that continued, you black out because it's not going to your head, and that's a bad thing. And so what happens is the vessel in your neck has sensors called baroreceptors. They sense the blood pressure instantaneously. And if the blood pressure starts to fall, they send a signal to your brain. Your brain sends a signal to the vessels in your leg to squeeze them. And it acts like a G-suit that a fighter pilot would wait to squeeze on the legs. Okay? Same principle as if somebody blacks out, you lie them down and stick their legs in the air. So you're returning blood to the heart. And so basically, your body does that instantaneously, and so therefore your blood pressure doesn't fall and you don't keel over, and that happens a million times a day and you don't notice it. In PBC patients, for whatever reason, probably to do with the cholestasis, in the sense the toxic effects of the bile acids, that doesn't work. So you have what's called baroreceptor insensitivity. And so your blood pressure starts to fall, and then that reflex doesn't kick in. So it continues to fall, okay? Now, the body has a fail-safe, which is to produce adrenaline, and adrenaline makes your heart beat faster. Now, if the blood pressure is dropping because you're pooling blood in your legs, making the heart beat faster is not the right solution to that. That's like having a your car brake system, having a leak in the car brake system, pushing harder on the pedal will have a short-term effect, but it's a very crude way of dealing with that. You actually need to fill the system again. So it will stop you blacking out, but it will make you feel a little bit edgy, and often people notice palpitations or they go a little bit red with it. So that's part of the body's reaction to it. So what's the multidisciplinary team? Well, first off, you need this diagnosing, which needs doctors and nurses in an autonomic clinic. But then you need to do the exercises that can retrain your body to recognize it. So that's where the physiotherapists come in to do the exercises to both to improve muscle function. This is the work done by Palat Trivedi and colleagues in Birmingham around exercise, but also part of that exercise is it actually normalizes the blood pressure systems. So all of this needs some simple interventions around just helping blood pressure return. We talk about these in our fatigue clinic all the time, and then some bigger interventions, but most of all it needs to be diagnosed, and it's a big part of it. And the question we always ask people is, do you ever feel dizzy when you stand up? And in particular, if you get up to go to the loo in the night, do you feel dizzy then? Okay, and that's the classic one. It's all made worse by GPs love a good antihypertensive treatment. So, you know, sometimes you think that they want to add antihypertensives and statins to the water. So we tend to overtreat high blood pressure. And what happens naturally with age is blood pressure drops. With PBC, blood pressure drops. But people who had high blood pressure earlier in life, they continue on the treatments. So actually the simplest intervention of all of these things is just to review antihypertensive medication. So yeah, it's a really important part. We've never systematically looked at these interventions. Julia went off and did a lot of chronic fatigue syndrome work, but it feeds into our day-to-day practice. We're probably the only people that talk about it and do it. But I can tell you, other than treating itch at night that stops people sleeping, around this is where the quick wins come in. And our simple steps where, you know, we don't send people to falls and syncope service if they say every time I stand up at night I get really dizzy, because we know what the answer is. So what we tend to do first off is review their antihypertensives and stop them if they don't need them anymore. And then the other one is to get people to drink 2 litres of fluid before lunch, all right? Clear, water, not fizzy drinks because that'd be bad for you, but drink 2 litres of water before lunch, right? And people hate it because they're peeing endlessly. But what that does is over about 8 weeks, it's the simplest way of retuning your baroreceptor. And I can tell you, a number of people who come back and said, I thought that was nonsense when he suggested I'd do it. And it really works. You don't need to continue it forever, ever. So, and please not tea and coffee, because they are diuretics. You actually end up more dehydrated. So it's not forever. You will adapt to it, but it will basically retune your body to operate with a higher blood volume. There you go.
No, that's really interesting, because we actually have had quite a few questions about dizziness recently. So I'll make a little special out of this video and pop it up on YouTube as well.
Wait until I do the Q&A, because I'm the man,
Apparently so. Apparently so.
Somebody would describe me recently as the godfather of PBC. And I didn't know. Does that mean that I put, horse's head in the bed of other people? I don't know.
I've also heard the term rock star of PBC. I think we use that as rock star.
Oh no, I quite like that. Okay.
Actually, there's a question came in just when we were chatting about dizziness. They're asking if urso can cause dizziness. No, that's fine. I just thought it was, because it was asked in the chat here, I thought it was worth just mentioning it because we were talking about it.
But urso and dizziness do go together, but they go together through PBC.
Because of the PBC. Perfect. Thank you. And also, I just wanted to say, when I mentioned about the article that was found, that wasn't me that found that. That was our patient that found that. When she'd found your article about dizziness, it was our patient who had found that, not me. So she'd gone and that's our patient. She'd gone and done her own research.
I think that's brilliant, because that's what you should do. And can I suggest for those people who, the world is a much more democratic and accessible place than it used to be. And so there are 2 sites that you can go to, one of which is a thing called PubMed, PUBMED, which is the American government's literature searching site. They're public access. You can just go in on a computer and use it. And the other is Google Scholar. So Google, not the main Google, but a thing called Google Scholar. And basically, if you are interested, you've suddenly thought, oh, hang on a second, you know, I've got a high lead level in the blood and PBC, and you want to answer that question, you just go in, you type PBC and then lead, and you press the button, and it will tell you all of the papers that link it all together. And any of us can do that. Anybody can do that. And it's really interesting. And so watch out, though. PBC isn't always described as PBC. It can be primary biliary cholangitis. It can be primary biliary, another word we don't mention. It also used to be liver cirrhosis, biliary. So sometimes the older stuff, it's difficult to find unless you use those different terms. But it's all there. And the other way to do it is you can search by authors. So if you think, if we've done something, then you search, Jones D Newcastle. Now, unfortunately, Jones is quite a common name, and so therefore you'll find lots of people who've done lots of things. But if you just put Jones D Newcastle, then you'll find a few other things, but mainly our stuff, and you can take it from there. So it's do play around with it. It's really interesting. Now, also remember, not everything that's in papers is correct. Remember Andy Wakefield on the MMR, right? So there's a filter we need to apply, but anybody who wants to raise a particular paper that they've seen which is interesting, let us know, and we'll talk about it in these meetings. That's what we do. So I think it's absolutely brilliant if people have gone off, accessed the literature and found that stuff, and that is in mainstream clinical practice, just hasn't been built on, but we still do it all right now, and it absolutely makes a difference.
I've got great. I've got questions on our list, but also a question that's came in live that kind of links. So a sort of general question was, is it important to be under a specialist consultant versus a hepatology consultant in the gastro department who covers all liver issues in general? And then as a follow-on to that, someone's asked us, they've got their first gastro telephone appointment tomorrow. What should they be asking? So that's quite a good general mix of general advice as well. So let's put them together.
So what you want, what do you want out of a consultant, if you like, is that you want somebody that you relate to and trust. Confidence is really important. Okay, so that you feel comfortable, and you feel comfortable personally, and you feel that they are listening to you and doing the right things. Okay, so that's the main thing that you want. You ideally want somebody local, but not at any price, because it's important to get this right. And so, in America, people fly from New York to the middle of America to the Mayo Clinic twice a year for their care. Americans think nothing of doing that. So, we get people who don't get proper care because they don't want to travel 5 miles. And I think that we need to get out of that habit. So you want to be managed by somebody who you feel comfortable with around PBC, and you can benchmark the sorts of things that your consultant is talking about with the information the foundation gives out and the sorts of things we talk about the Q&A sessions. Okay, now there are across the UK a number of exceptional PBC doctors. Okay, and in pretty much every region there are exceptionally good PBC doctors. Okay, most of those would describe them as a hepatologist, okay? But most of them, doing some gastroenterology, but they would be a hepatologist in their title. But most of them are not only, it's easy for me, I only do PBC. So they're not only PBC people. I'm not going to name names because it's disingenuous, but there are some really good people who really get this, who are part of our network and part of our education and are aware of all of this. So it does not have to be something like me or a George Mells or a Palat Trivedi. There are lots of people who are really good and thoughtful at managing their patients. Okay, and so it's not just as simple as what sort of person. Okay, as a rule, I think that the best way to care for these diseases is in a clinic where you only see those people. Okay, so we have 3 PBC clinics a week in Newcastle. That's the scale of what we do. So it's very easy for us to do that. People might say we've only got 50 patients, we can't run a daily clinic. Well, you can once a month, you know. So you could do that once a month. So and the reason why doing a PBC clinic is important, because you're benchmarking your management against other PBC rather than other types of liver disease. So really good is to have a kind of a system where either it's a single clinic or people kind of collect the information around it. At the other end of the spectrum, I do not think you should be mixing this in with bowel disease, because it's too difficult to zone in on what you need to do. Okay. So so I think you need to have somebody, I mean, in general, and also the other thing, of course, is that it depends what the problem is. So people, we see plenty of people with really mild PBC, completely controlled on earth, so no symptoms, get their bone density done every 5 years. They don't need to go to a specialist clinic. They need to go and they need to maybe just see a specialist nurse in a hospital that they're very familiar with and comfortable with, and they can contact if they have any problems. So there can be an element, you know, don't overdo it. But the worry is the other end, where people are not having it all taken seriously. Okay. So I think the question for the things that so if I was talking to somebody the first time, okay, I would what I would do, because they'll have a lot of your blood tests, because that's how the system works. So what I would do, I'm giving the tricks of the trade now. First up, the very first thing I would say is, right, I want you to listen really carefully. There's nothing to be worried about here, because I've seen the bloods and it's mild disease. If you do this, you know, unwrapping the parcel until the very end thing, people are waiting for something really horrible. And so I say, right, let's get this out of the way. I'm not worried about this. This is completely treatable. I'll explain what's going on, but don't ignore what I'm saying because you're worried, because you don't need to, right? That's what I always do that. So, and then I would run through it all. I would find out, you know, what problems they got, symptoms. So we'd run through, you know, the history of treatment, you know, symptoms, how confident you were in the diagnosis. And then I would explain to people what this is, what's happened, why they've got it, tell them that there's nothing they could have done to prevent it, talk about family risk, because that's always something people worry about. And then we talk about what we're going to do. And I would start people on earth. So that visit. So I know some people say, oh, we need to repeat the tests and then we need to explain it. So people go and consider nonsense, just start the tablets, right? So we would give people a prescription on day 1 and say, this is totally treatable and here's the treatment, right? And, you know, you would then we'd have an early phone visit just to check you're okay with the tablets and do all of that. So I think the questions that you ask, if you're new to all of this, it's less what you ask them, it's more what they ask you and whether they do the things that you would want to do. So you want them to explain why they think it's this and how confident they are in the diagnosis. That will depend on the tests. You would want them to explain what their approach to therapy is, and if they don't, you ask them, what's your approach to treatment? And then you would want them to ask about your symptoms, even if you haven't got any symptoms, because they don't know that until they ask you. And then I would ask them, what's your approach to DEXA scanning around the bones? Okay. And what you want is somebody who just goes, yes, of course. No, absolutely, you're right. We do that so I would say we do a DEXA scan to start with, and we do it after that every 1 to 5 years, depending on what the baseline one is. Good point, forgot to mention it. But if they prevaricate and that makes you think they're not kind of on the ball, right? And then the real bellwether is whether people assess second line therapy need or not. And we use the term the bellwether. That comes from Scotland, actually, from Bell Rock. Do you know this?
No.
The term bellwether is that there's a bell rock off Edinburgh, and they have a bell on it to warn ships in bad weather, and it's the bellwether. Okay, and this is where I tell my favourite rock and roll story, because I'm a rock star, as you've told a day. There's a very famous story about a rock band, Van Halen, who used to insist that they had M&Ms in their dressing room backstage. And they had to have the brown ones taken out. And it's always used as the metaphor for rock and roll excess, that you are so rock and roll that you want to have. And for those of you familiar with Spinal Tap, the film, they included that in it, where they wanted the brown ones taken out. And poor old Van Halen got ridiculed for all of this. It's rock and roll excess. The true story is that actually one of their roadies was killed on stage by a light falling from a gantry. Okay, and after that, they had a very, very rigorous approach to safety, and they had requirements about what had been done for safety and had it been checked. Okay, and it's easy for people to say they've done it and more difficult for them to do it. So they included the M&Ms thing on the grounds that if anybody actually went through the M&Ms and took the brown ones out, they're likely to have done the other stuff properly as well. It's a bellwether. So we use URSO response. Have you assessed URSO response and what have you done about it? Because if you can answer that question with a constructive answer, you've probably done all the other things right. But it's a bit early for you with that. Mm-hmm. But most of all, confidence in your consultant that they and the fact that you like talking to them and that you feel comfortable to raise issues, and then just ask them about what the follow-up is going to be, especially have your specialist nurse who can be contactable about things. And it's just, if it feels right, it is going to be right. And I think one of the things we sort of need to do is to support people if it doesn't feel right and it's not the right thing. And, you know, believe me, by being on this call and listening to this and being engaged in the foundation, you are well on the way for this being fine, okay? Because you are amongst people who can support you with that. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Robert is a force of nature, as everybody knows. And I know recently of somebody, because I was kind of involved in giving some guidance. I don't know if I should tell you this story, but somebody who had not been getting the right advice and had been being fobbed off. And Robert and Mo kind of right past me, which is one of the things that we do, sense check, you know, are we being sensible about this? And I said, no, this is rubbish, you know, this is appalling management. And they weren't going anywhere at all. And it was, you know, some distance away from Edinburgh. And Robert went with her to her appointment. Okay.
He did. Yeah.
With her appointment, right? Mm-hmm. That's the nature of what we all collectively do, is that help you with the, you know, nobody wants to have to do that, but, you know, you have to do it if you have to do it. But they will help you with the right questions and guide it and what you do. The worry we have is the problem is and signposting towards the PBC Foundation is in the guidelines, okay? So this idea that we signpost people towards the foundation, you know, or a patient group in another disease area, it's not a nice thing to do. It's actually a requirement of the guidelines. It's standard practice. And so the worry for us is that poor clinicians who don't know what to do about PBC are almost always the ones who don't signpost people either. So it's rather like people who don't have an MOT on their car, they don't have insurance or a driving license either. And so they don't maintain the car. So the danger is that where it's not going properly, you know, all aspects are bad. And I think that's where web presence and spreading the information and giving out cards with QR codes about, you know, anything you can do to signpost people. Mm-hmm. And, you know, just if you're out there, bump into people who say, oh, I've got PBC, tell them about the foundation, because it's that availability of, you know, most times it's fine and it's right and it all goes okay, but when it isn't and you're uncomfortable, you don't know what to do. That's the value of an organization like that. I think the concept of Robert rocking up with a patient in the clinic is actually terrifying. I mean, you know, what the message that sends, it's mind-blowing.
And I think just, you know, looking at what we can do is that we were in Brussels protesting as a group, and then just a few days later, Robert's gone with someone to a clinic appointment, you know, so we're balancing but still trying to be really available for patients as well.
And I think that I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. Is that it? You know, on the one hand, it's, you know, really influential. I'll repeat what I said earlier about the impact of the foundation in creating that noise around OCA. That's at a national level, having something to say nationally, the politician, things like that. And then it's rolling your sleeves up. I'm a rolled up sleeves kind of guy, you know. And it's then rolling your sleeves up and grafting when it really matters. And then in between, you have the education and the research support and things. And sometimes patient groups become too important to actually look after actual people, because they like, I mean, I've done some stuff nationally with a national group who were actually quite, nothing to do with any of this, but were actually quite dismissive of patients. Okay. You know, it's art, but they were doing a lot of lobbying in London, and they were a very professional. They were a national patients group, but they were really lobbyists around all of that. One of them said to me, "It's not our job to improve the care that Granny gets in the clinic." And I said, "Au contraire, I think it's precisely your job to do that." And actually, I find that condescending, snooty, and embarrassing. And I haven't spoken to them since. Okay.
And I know we've run over time a little bit, but I just wanted to ask one last question, if that's okay.
One last question. I have to go
because it has
regulation and obeticholic acid, as you
because
inevitably
it has,
anything else to talk about.
It has touched on something that you mentioned earlier. So you did touch on family risk when you were talking about that. And we have had a question that's come in live that said, has there been any rise in cases of mother-daughter PBC? Should my daughters be tested? I have PBC. My mother had it, and I'm worried about my 4 daughters.
Oh, okay, right. So there's no change around that. There's no change in the data. There's no change in the pattern as we understand it. So the kind of explanation here is that there is a genetic component to PBC. As somebody whose mother had it, it's kind of obvious, but it's a weak genetic association. So something like haemophilia or cystic fibrosis or whatever will have a very strong genetic association. PBC is a weak genetic association. It's a bit like families where there's families where lots of people got cancer and lots of people got heart disease. We see families who've got lots of PBC or some PBC, right? And it's to do with the genes that construct the immune system. So it's all about your immune system genes. And basically, people with PBC are too easy. Their immune system turns on too easily, and it turns off, a bit reluctantly. And that's why it is. And of course, go back to what we said about COVID. At the end of the day, your immune system protects you against infections. And so this over-aggressive immune system in a different situation is probably beneficial, which is why it stays in the population, right? So, but it's absolutely reasonable for people to be worried about it. And of course, one-off, if somebody's just got it, it's one concern. But, mum to daughter to 4 granddaughters, that's a very obvious concern, okay? And anybody, you get situations people say, oh, it's not, it's not genetic, it's not inherited. Well, if you've got mum and daughter, then that's, my own eyes told me something different. Okay, the risk is actually relatively low. We know the risk. It is exactly the relative risk, okay, for a daughter with a mother with PBC or a mother with a daughter with PBC, that the risk that the other will have it is 35-fold, okay, 35 times more likely. Now, you are going to turn around and say, good God, that's huge, but only 30 per 100,000 of the population get PBC. So it's 30 by 30, right? So it's still less than 1%, right? So that's important. So the difference between absolute risk and relative risk. The relative risk is quite high. The absolute risk is low because the disease is very rare. Okay, so each of your daughters has about a 1%, a little bit less than that, risk of getting PBC at some point in their life. If you have a son, multiply that, divide that by 10, because PBC is 10-fold less common. Okay, and I have never seen a familial case of PBC in a son. Okay, never seen one in all my years doing it. Right. So, how do you use that information when you're talking to your daughters? There are 2 ways of looking at it. One is to that at the end of the day, why not find out? So you can go and say, I like to have an antibody test for PBC. The downside of that is that then has implications for health declarations, for insurance, travel insurance, life insurance, and things like that, because why would you screen for disease unless you're at risk of getting the disease? And so there is a downside to it. And given that, 99 times out of 100, you won't find the disease, you've given yourself a problem without any advantage from it. Okay, so that's why we don't routinely screen it. Now, the counter view is that if you are terrified as an individual of this because mum's had problems, grandmother's had problems, and you can't sleep at night because you're worried about it. So it's clearly in your advantage to put that to rest. So we would have exactly this discussion, and sometimes we test and sometimes we don't test. And if we don't test, we get people to say to their children, there is this familial risk. If you're ever found to have abnormal liver blood tests, or you're ever tired or get the itch, then tell the doctor and ask them to test for PBC, because there's a reason to do it at that point. Okay, so that's our standard advice, and about 80% of the time people don't test. Okay, there is a different world now, and nowadays you can get online tests. So if you go onto the interweb and put AMA test, there are companies that will do an AMA test on a finger prick of blood. Okay, so you do a finger prick, put it onto a bit of blotting paper, send it off to the lab, and it costs about 50 quid or something, and they will do an AMA test. And actually those tests are remarkably accurate, because of the test is a very robust one. Okay, now that has the advantage that you know the answer, but the doctor doesn't know you've done it. So if you then have to fill in a health, what you've chosen to do on the internet is nothing to do with an insurance company. So if you want to know if you're AMA positive or not, then you can just do that. These tests are pretty accurate, as I said, and if it's negative, it's put your mind at risk and nobody knows. And if it's positive, well, then there's a reason for you to want to have the rest of the blood test done, because you may benefit from therapy. And so I think that's an option for people, is to get these tests off the internet. It's purely a home thing. Nobody doesn't go any medical records, and you know the answer. And a negative test will be very accurate. And so I mention that to people, and we never really know if people go off and do that or not, but I would do that in that situation, because it gives you an answer and you're most likely to be reassured. And if you're not reassured, then you can go to the doctor, and there's a reason to do it. So I think that's a reasonable thing. But generally speaking, the risk is there, but it is low. It is not worse in the daughters of mothers with PBC. It doesn't accelerate like that, and it's just a thing. But we do see it. But it's not a very frequent thing. But I've never seen it in sons of mothers or fathers, for that matter. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's us for today. Thank you so much for your time. It's always really lovely to have you. I just want to say there are quite a lot of questions that we didn't get through today, but please know I'll pick them up.
Well, that's because I waffled on too much.
Yeah, I will pick them up.
I told you a fatuous story about Van Halen, but given their fellow rock stars,
we've got you back next week.
To celebrate that,
We've got you back next week as well, though. So we've got. We'll make sure all the questions are gathered up for next week, and I'll keep a note.
Well, I'm going to wear dark glasses and a leather jacket next week.
I'll get you a blow-up guitar for next week. But just to say to anyone, if there is anything urgent that you need to speak to us, please call us on the helpline, and we'll help you direct with that. Please don't wait.
I agree with that absolutely, and don't forget the image of Robert going to a consultation. Now, it should never get to that point, but that is fundamentally and I think that's a beautiful point you made about the protest, and then because they're the opposite ends of it, and you need both. Is the answer?
We talked about it in a team. It was actually really touching.
Whatever you do in life, for an organisation like you don't forget your roots. Okay. Yeah, and the foundation, I never stop saying, the foundation has the most comprehensive network of supporters for PBC of any organisation, including across the country, including the NHS. So the PBC Foundation has better coverage of PBC expertise across the country than the NHS does. Okay.
Yeah, and we're here all the time to help. Just reach out to us if you need us.
I'm not, because I have to go and record the next album.
Right, thank you so much for your time, and I shall see you next week.
Never ever going to hear the end of that. You do know that.
Don't regret me saying it. Right.
Bye, everybody.
See you later. Bye.